What's happening, angels and devils, beauties and beasts? We're back after my month or so long excursion from the YouTube sphere. As human beings, we're not merely one or the other of those things that I introduced the video with, but each of us is both, and as individuals, we're our own unique variety of being both angelic and devilish and beautiful and beastly. Sort of play on words, and I use these to start off the video because they can, I think, orient the direction of the rest of the video. And the reason I've been gone is because I've been concentrating mainly on schoolwork. Well, a little bit and a little bit no. I'm certainly a procrastinating type where I'll find all sorts of other things to do until the very last minute and just have enough time to get everything done that I need to. But I've been focusing on school in that sort of haphazard way, and also just kind of using the internet a lot more than I typically do, at least for social media and stuff like that. Often I stay away from it, but then I'll have phases where, particularly in school, when I can't really devote myself to what I think are interesting books and studies outside of school that I do independently. When I can't do that, that's when I'll delve more into schoolwork and doing those things that I just said, looking at my phone, looking at YouTube, and all that stuff. So that's basically what I've been doing. And I don't know, it's ever since I was young, I've always been somebody who found school to be just really soulless, and I came to resent it for that reason. But I understand that there being so many people in the world to give an education and to bring up so that they can become functional members of the world, it's to expect our educational institutions to satisfy students at a spiritual level is a bit much, and we really just teach people the basics of what they ought to know about the world and history and how to move through life, and I think that's fine, but I just always found it wanting, and the closest thing that we get taught with regard to spirituality or spiritual life is maybe in the 10th grade we'll read Shakespeare for a couple of weeks, or in earlier grades we'll read some novels that are pretty good and reputable and all of that, and that's fine. But I personally have just been somebody very keenly interested in spirituality or spiritual life, religion, or if you like, the occult and hidden realm that each of us sees and lives within our self-consciousness. The word occult traced back to Latin occultus, just means hidden or secret, not obvious. And if you can admit to yourself as an individual self-conscious person that you do see some kind of hidden reality which others are not able to see, at least in the way that you can, from your singular perspective, that all of us move through life knowing that just because I had this feeling in this moment, or this thought, or any sort of internal happening you like, doesn't mean that others were as sensitive to it as I, and that people are reading my thoughts, or they know when I had this specific feeling and what exactly it was like for me. It's like we're hiding this one region of reality in our unique self-consciousness that we have as an individual person. And then there's an obvious region of our life where we are moving about in the world and we're leaving definite marks on people and places, and we have a distinct character that people come to know as we continue to move through life. And just ever since I was a kid, really, I have been very, very interested in the sort of dialogue or dialectic that plays out between these two basic regions of life that each of us as individuals experience and move through and occupy, namely the sort of hidden inner realm that we alone as self-consciousness are able to see, and then the kind of shared realm or intersubjective realm where we're in the society of all sorts of other individual self-consciousnesses and just people with whom we share a space and we interact with one another and build up environments, modify them, and do all of this stuff. Whereas there is a kind of world like that for each of us individually, but in a place where we alone are able to see it. And so it's just a kind of hypothesis, and it's actually a pretty popular one, that self-consciousness is able to interact both with his subtle and inner life and also with the one without, and that actually, depending on how one does this, addresses the inner things that happen in one's own private awareness, how one interacts with them and evaluates them, treats them. And I'm here talking about just thoughts or simple feelings that arise, or that it's almost like a conversational interchange between you, subject, or me, subject, and this thought, sensation, or feeling that you had or that I had, and we as individual people alone experiencing reality have this kind of interchange between the specific things we experience. And just to say it one more time, there's kind of the obvious things that we interact with. If I, for example, sip from my cup of coffee, well, my hand made that motion, the cup arose, there's now less coffee in the cup, and there's these very obvious effects that came about as a consequence of my thinking about wanting to sip this coffee and then going about doing it. And then there are, rather than coffee cups and drink coffee, there are objects in my own self-conscious, private, and inner existence that I also deal with, but that in dealing with them, you guys are not able to see that I am dealing with them in the way that you just saw me deal with this coffee cup in a very obvious and observable way. There are interchanges that I am having with things in my awareness that you guys don't see, but that are nevertheless just as consequential, even arguably more consequential, because the failure to interact in this clear and self-aware sort of way with the things that happen in one's own subjectivity, one's inner life, arguably, this is what explains people's acting blindly and lashing out and perhaps causing a bunch of destruction and creating unneeded problems all over the world, that maybe when we come across such people who are this way and who are a burden to themselves and to everybody else, it's perhaps an instance where we meet a subject, a self-consciousness, which has not taken up its responsibility in having a self-conscious interaction with things that it experiences, and doing it in a thoughtful and considerate way and not being overcome by one's lesser natures. And whether one becomes more self-conscious, I think, is the deciding factor, whether one will succumb to one's lesser natures. And I don't think we have to do it, and I think it happens too often that people get into this vicious circle of a very narrow sort of consciousness that really only brings them an impoverished life that's not very fruitful and enjoyable or appreciable. That depending on how one as consciousness or subject interacts with one's experience of life, depending how much one engages in that interaction, one has a greater or a lesser spiritual life. This has always been a sort of conviction of mine since I was very young, that I'm in a sort of dialogue that, insofar as I keep living, I have to engage in, or else my character will suffer and my psyche will suffer, or maybe my world will suffer because my psyche is suffering, and insofar as I act at all in the world, I'm just creating problems because I haven't taken care of things in the non-obvious realm of my life, where you guys are not able to see, but I am perfectly able to see. And it just interested me, and this is a big thing in mysticisms, how looking at something differently, anything differently, can lead you to different understandings or attitudes, insights, realizations. Is one, as subject or consciousness, can be very experimental with the simple experience of life that naturally happens for you. It's not like you have to do anything super difficult or really anything at all to have an experience of life which you are capable of attending to and becoming considerate of, involved in, engaged with, whatever you like. It's the difference between somebody who is blind and destructive and somebody who is instead productive and a joy to be around, is that the first does not appreciate the fullness of his experience of life and refuses to engage in a dialogue with it, and the other does engage this sort of dialogue and recognizes that there is sort of some kind of responsibility on the part of him as subject or soul or consciousness, whatever you like, and that I just don't think it's for no reason that we're self-conscious. It is arguably a biological disadvantage for us. It leads us to stagnation and nervousness and brooding. We can sometimes not get very much done as a consequence of self-consciousness because we're just dreading the consequences of things and want to keep problems to a minimum, or we want to behave perfectly, and we develop all of these high expectations that are just continually ruined by our experience of life, which steps on them. I think becoming more self-conscious and growing as a person in that way, a lot of it entails a sort of relativizing of one's expectations of life, or putting them into perspective and not taking them too darn seriously. Is life as it happens for us, is quite spontaneous, and we can never predict really what's going to happen next. We can, in certain instances for sure, some happenings are predictable, but for being honest, every single moment is entirely unprecedented and infinitely complex. We're not capable of examining and studying all that occurs to us in each and every moment. We hone in on certain things and leave out others, but at each moment is totally new. The problem is, and I think this is one thing that leads people to become blind and crude and mean, is that we tend to become so numb to the newness of each and every moment. It's being unprecedented without anything before it that is the same as it. There's new details to each and every moment that can be discovered and studied. And you don't have to be a scientist to investigate your experience of life, its many aspects, and even the whole thing. And so I think that there is so much opportunity for each of us as individual self-consciousnesses to look more deeply into what presents itself to us naturally, what makes itself known to us moment to moment. And you pay attention, you see it's always something new. It's with every passing moment, there is a jump of attention to here or there. There's a contraction of attention or fixation on this small set of details, or an abstraction where you're more widely aware of a vast range of different things all at once. Just noticing the behavior of attention, this has been called meditation and also called phenomenology. So similar in practice, I think, that we tend not to think of ourselves in this way, but each of us really is a natural phenomenon. We each are a sort of natural phenomenon that is, forgive me for being wordsy, endlessly investigable. We can investigate ourselves endlessly. And to do that, all you have to do is be considerate of your experience of life as it unfolds naturally. And don't overlook things that you think to be trivial and not important, but every time you have a thought or a feeling, or you notice your attention doing this or that, know that you are seeing what you are, and that we did not create ourselves. We belong to this infinitely vast chain of history and being, and it's not like there's being or existence and then there's we who are thrown into it and separate from it, but it's we belong to the continuum of the history of everything. And this may sound quite religious, is that's what a lot of, that's the function of much of religion, to give people that sense of everlastingness or being part of something everlasting, immortal, And I think that we do ourselves a disservice by rejecting religion altogether. I, at least, have found in my very brief studies of it, I have so much more to study, and will probably take a lifetime to really appreciate the bulk of it, and whether I can even attain to that level of amount of study. But I've found in just studying Christianity and Judaism and Eastern philosophies, you just find this overabundance of terms that are so subjectively significant. And also in phenomenology, out of the phenomenologists I've read Husserl the most, and I've read some essays by Heidegger. And it's so interesting, the similarity there is that both in religious scriptures and also in the literature of phenomenology, you find all of these words that indicate certain regions of subjectivity or modes of subjectivity, modes of being, of inner life. Words that indicate these things, and if you ask me, the greater part of them have to deal with freedom or liberation, and that might be the title of the video, is that I found wanting in our educational systems growing up any instruction about spiritual liberation, which had always been my interest since I was young, but only in recent years have I really been able to recognize that you don't get that sort of education in schools, and maybe we shouldn't even. Maybe it's for individuals to look into for themselves and to find in themselves. But suppose that liberation, spiritual liberation, enlightenment, is possible for each of us as individuals, but only possible, and it's not guaranteed. It doesn't just happen. There have to be moves on our part in the sort of way that I was describing in the beginning, how we as subject interact with our natural experience, or experience in its natural happening. We get that so easily, to the degree that we keep living, is we just have experiences. Things make themselves known to us in various or other ways. Whether we will be vigilant and attentive to the things that make themselves known to us, that is not ensured, and it may not happen if we're not up to the task. I think that, I don't know, I don't like to place myself anywhere on the whole free will determinism spectrum, but I think that we do have a little bit of something like free choice, but not without its limits and its causal prehistories and natural prehistories. And it's not like we just have this immaterial freedom that's just not at all involved in our organism, and it's not in any way natural. It's like, I think insofar as we have freedom, it is perfectly compatible with the organism that we are, and that we are also kind of in a deterministic universe. Just ask yourself simple, rudimentary questions. Did I make my body? Or if I have free choice, did I choose to have free choice in the way it would be for me once I'm living in the world? I think I can't get the wording exactly right, but Emil Cioran has some aphorism in his book, The Trouble with Being Born, that in order for responsibility to be valid, we would have to have been made aware of the fact that we would be responsible as human beings for a whole lifetime, and to accept that that is the case, that we're free to choose the whole way down for a human lifetime, and that we're not made aware of this before our lives makes responsibility, personal responsibility, invalid. Because if you think about it, can we really, even if we do, assuming we do right now have free choice, can we say that we are free to choose if we have forcibly been put into a situation where we're not free to choose to be not free to choose? And it's this kind of conundrum where only a crazy person will tell you, oh yeah, before I was ever born in the spirit realm, I was made aware that I would have to live a lifetime of being free to choose everything, and I accepted it sincerely and am up to it. It's nobody admits that that has happened to them, and so it's like we're doomed to be free, as the Sartre quote goes. And well, I have my problems with free choice and determinism, and I think that in both of them we just make inevitable reductions of the reality that we are, in a certain level, imprisoned and predetermined and not free, but we are also, on another level, a higher level, quite free. And I don't like to call this freedom free choice, but liberation, salvation, those sorts of things get more to the point of what I'm talking about. Or even, I would say, observation, that in observing one's experience or observing reality, there is a freedom that proves itself to somebody who is in that state of observation. But also, there can be something like salvation, liberation, conversion. Great chapter on religious conversion in William James' Varieties of Religious Experience. And there and elsewhere, there is talk about this sort of point A to point B kind of shift in one's inner spiritual being. It's the moment before the conversion and the moment after contrast so much as to be undeniable, and individuals know this inwardly, but it's not something that can really be explained. One just kind of knows it oneself, that something is just fundamentally different in one's life following this kind of shift, this spiritual evolution. And I think that that's possible, and that self-consciousness is involved in this, and depending how it interacts with the life it finds itself in, or even you might say the life it finds itself as, that we can't think of self-consciousness as being removed from the total context of the life of which it is aware. And I think that too often we get stuck at lower levels of our life where we're not observant or not spiritual in our element, and appreciative of being alive at all, that we can actually become grateful for life even when it's gotten really bad for us and really bad for everybody, just by escaping the lower levels of our emotions and becoming doubtful about life and ourselves, and this kind of paralytic self-consciousness that I was talking about earlier. It's I don't think that people have to stay there, but I think that a lot of us do get there where we reach a level of unsureness and even disappointment with life itself in how it's happened or been happening or is destined to happen. Things can just look so ugly in life, whether we're looking back in history or we're anticipating things in the future, or the now is filled with all of these devils and terrible things that make it grotesque. I think that, just in a word, inner life can just become so horrid and so abysmal and disgusting and repulsive, and that we, for our maturity's sake and for society's sake, the world's sake, can't simply dwell in that place or succumb to it and be overcome by it, because that is when I think people begin to act blindly and they lash out and rage and wreak havoc. And if they're not doing that, then it's more they're just left to a sort of private internal torture that is almost like what I was describing before about the invisible objects in one's own subjectivity. That the invisible objects in subjectivity, the mental events or psychic, the inner happenings, any and all of them, I think that we need to begin treating these as importantly, if not in certain cases more importantly, than mere physical phenomena and outer events. That inner happenings can be just as catastrophic. And the analogy I wanted to make was recently in Kentucky and Arizona and possibly some other states. I need to do more looking into statistics and the storyline about the tornadoes that have been happening there and just how devastating, or one tornado, or I don't know if it's multiple. I have a lot more homework to do. I just know many people died from it, and cities were destroyed, utterly destroyed, and just catastrophe. Terribly consequential event, the tornado thing that happened there. And I think that there are inner happenings of such a magnitude where people are just thrown so far out of their depth that they have a lot of inner and subjective work to do in order to essentially rebuild their personality in wake of these devastating inner events. That the older I got, more in my later adolescence, after I had experimented with psychedelics a little bit and got into meditation and more deeply into philosophy and introspection and all of that, I think people who go this road of considering things and really thinking things through and not just being an automaton and going through life asleep and not considerate of what one is doing or how one is. One of my viewers said something about the how of moving through life and how this is what matters. Is we ask ourselves, how are we going to move through? It's not so much what we do with our lives. It is that to some degree, but the how is more fundamental, because we can be doing anything or be in any situation, but if the how of our being, how we are, is not up to speed and it's not enriched, then we will look at our lives in hindsight when we grow old and it comes time to die, and we won't be satisfied with the life we've led. And so that's almost another end of the spectrum of what I was saying about our needing to respect inner happenings of subjective existence more, as though they were as consequential as these natural and physical happenings on the outside, such as happened in Kentucky and Arizona, that each of us as individuals can be as affected by thoughts, emotions, feelings, inner happenings of any and all kinds as Kentucky and Arizona were affected by the tornado. And that this is a serious problem, but on the other spectrum, as I was just getting to there with the whole how of life, sort of getting into the direction of, am I free? Am I liberated inside? Am I living the highest human being possible? That there are inner events of this character too, such as are indicated by the word in Zen Buddhism, satori, and initiates will experience a moment of satori where Brahman or ultimate reality or whatever you like manifests itself to these people, and it's in an undeniable way that does lead thereafter to the kind of conversion experience where one has in a moment seen what matters for one's moving through life in the best way possible, a kind of assurance and confidence is gained as a consequence of one's recognizing the unanimity of oneself and ultimate reality. The whole thing. The big thing of life and death and existence. That there's no way for us to fall outside of it. We are so much a part of it and can never be removed from it. And thus, we really then ought to appreciate our inner lives a lot more than we do. I said a while back that I would talk about Colin Wilson's book, The New Existentialism, which I think is worthy to discuss, and I never got around to it on here, but I'll bring up a core point in that book is that he observed that human beings habitually reduce their experiences of life. We become numb to our experiences, and they strike us as too bland and usual and uninteresting. But unbeknownst to us, our experiences are so interesting, and we can never exhaust their contemplative possibilities. We can probe into anything we want about our experiences, and the possibilities are infinite. We underestimate our experiences, and we underestimate our capacity to probe into them and attend to their many, many facets. And like I said before, the whole thing is that really, and this happens in Satori, I think, and other certain moments of salvation like that, the whole thing becomes a marvel for one. That is the object of appreciation and contemplation, is that one is struck and affected by the whole thing that is one's rich subjective experience of life, that it is seen for what it is in its richness, and you realize that beforehand you had been looking at it in this very reductive and shallow kind of way that made it seem not so interesting, and even made it seem a burden. That for people like Aldous Huxley and Carl Jung, and even Nietzsche and Rilke and I wrote down some names on my notes over here. All people who particularly struck me as proponents of this ambition of self-consciousness where one refuses to settle for the lower existence and being a victim to and slave of the lower emotions and passions and all of that. It's no doubt we have passions and instincts and impulses, and we behave crudely, we think and feel crudely. No doubt there are dirty aspects to each and every one of us, and if we're being honest, then we'll come right out with that, but if not, then we'll try to hide it from ourselves and other people. There's no escaping the dirtiness or the dirt of what we are, but this is only the lower level of what we are, and there are also upper levels, and when we begin to speak about these, we're getting into the direction of talking about liberation or salvation and those things, freedom, where we are free. There are levels of our self-conscious existence where we are assuredly free, and there are others where we are not free and cannot be free, and that is like these lower feelings and emotions and gravitations and are doing sort of irrational and thoughtless things in our privacy and also in the world. We all do this to some or other degree, but I think there are ways of sort of managing this, and that comes with the attainment to the upper levels, is that we can have vices and bad habits, but we cannot let them dominate our lives and define them by doing things that engage us at the upper levels and cause us to use them, employ them more. So what comes to mind for me is a kind of occupational, if you know some activity that you love and that you're really good at and that can be fruitful and productive in the world and contribute something to it, that's a certain way of engaging the upper levels of your life. But even more fundamental than that, I think that we can do this more invisibly, where we are engaging the upper levels, but it's not in any way that people are able to see directly, but it should come off in a more indirect way in our simple dealings in the world. It's not that having attained to some upper levels of our subjective inner life, we're doing some magnificent task or displaying some unique and extraordinary talent. There's nothing wrong with that, and I encourage people to do it if they're capable, but whatever is your occupation, vocation, whatever you do, whoever you associate with in whatever places, I think that individuals who engage with the upper levels, the occult and hidden levels of their inner existence, if they're doing that well and really becoming spiritual, attaining to a higher spirituality, it comes off in a more indirect way where people sense in your simple presence a kind of development, and that this person is advanced and has not succumbed to lower levels, but is actually self-conscious in a developed and differentiated sort of way, that there's actually some interesting things going on in that inner life of that person, because he chose not to give in to the sleep of the everyday that is so tempting. We need the sleep of the everyday in order for us to have a world where anything happens, a society where anything happens, is that one might say, in our simple dealings with one another and making environments and behaving in them It's a kind of sleep. We're in this sort of shared societal dream when we do this. And then when we return to solitude and really begin to reflect on things and reflect on what we are and what the whole thing of existence is, the universe is, whether in any way we're continuous with the whole thing of history, existence, being, ultimate reality. And people really dealing with these questions in a thoughtful and considerate way find that they are moving up in the levels of their subjectivity and dealing with realities that, though invisible to others, nevertheless are consequential and can be so in very positive ways. That is, in the effort to become more spiritual and more developed as a person, one finds that one cannot do this without some sort of grasp on what one is. And this is why I think that religious literacy is so important, but often underestimated, and we don't teach it very much, is that it doesn't seem important to us to teach people about the ideations of the world's religions and their beliefs and what they hold to be the structures of reality, which I think it is in large part what religions serve to do, is that each offers its own reality structures and gives you words and parables and stories and symbols and all of this that aid in your dealings with the invisible life that you harbor inside and can enrich your spirituality and make you a more developed sort of person. That most of us now just kind of shrug off any religious terminology or ideas and symbols and all of that as just made up and something we couldn't verify, even if it did have some kind of inner reality. And I think that this is a tremendous disservice to ourselves and humanity, is reducing these religious terms. And also I think we need to pay a lot more attention to phenomenology, because it, in a strange sense, is a sort of echo of former religions, but to the purpose of advancing science and making it better. Is that truly religious people are resigned from the world or renounce the world in a similar way that the phenomenologist or the scientist, the phenomenological scientist, does. That in order to be observant of one's experience of reality, one has to step back from it and abstract from it and return as much as possible to this kind of pure awareness without trying to introduce things to your experience or reduce it in any way. So there's a kind of world renunciation in that sense for phenomenology and science, but then for individual human beings as moral creatures or religious creatures, as people are more or less religious to the degree that they renounce their world and their experience in this sort of way, that one is not prey to one's lesser natures, but one is able to see them and to set them apart and just say, I have weaker inclinations and lusts and petty desires. This is just every human being has these in some or other form, but one can not allow them to be absolute for the sake of one's attaining to a more rich spiritual existence, which is not to say that you just give up your vices and don't act on any of your whims anymore and just become this sort of superhuman who has no flaws. Nobody can do this, really. Even if you go to a monastery, I'm sure people do some crude and apish things when they are alone, and it's just almost an eternal truth of human beings that we do this, even if it's only when we're most alone. It still happens in some or other way, but the lower levels, desires, vices, lusts, greed, all of that lives in us simultaneously with spirituality and self-consciousness and observation. These upper levels, they coexist in each of us as individual human beings, but one can give freedom to all of these different levels and live life more gratefully as a consequence of engaging with life in a spiritual and engaged sort of way, recognizing that we did not create ourselves, life did not begin with us. We are this insanely complex organism with a physical structure, but we also have this hidden inner life that somehow combined with the thing that is our body. There is with our body some kind of thing which is self-conscious existence, and it can take on so many characters, and it's actually its own sort of wilderness that we have to be very cautious about, or else we can get lost in the wilderness, or we can be overcome by the monsters of our solitude, namely certain emotions or thoughts or deliriums, craziness. We all have that sort of stuff in us, and in attaining to a higher self-consciousness, one has to reckon with these dark and grim inner realities, but also to hold them in front and to recognize them as realities and recognize that you don't have to fall prey to them completely, though they may exist, continue to exist on a lower level of one's life. One stands to recognize the darkness of one's thoughts or emotions if it gets to that place in your spiritual development, and then transcend them as a consequence of recognizing that one is not the same as them, and that even the inner happenings of our life, in the same way that we don't claim responsibility for making the earth or the sky, the clouds, and governing how they behave and what they look like and all that. It's like the earth just happens to look like what it happens to look like, and the clouds happen to move and shape themselves in the way that they do, and the sky is just what it is, and that's how we think about these things. But when it comes to inner life, sometimes we subjectify the things that happen within us, and in that way treat them as of lesser importance. I had the thought yesterday, it's that because no one apart from we ourselves as individuals can see the happenings of our inner lives, we claim this sort of possession of the things that happen in our solitary self-consciousness. We put the label ours on these things sometimes, like particularly I would say with our thoughts, but also with feelings and emotion, that we impose our own egoity, our egohood on them, and in that way reduce their value, but I think brought into fresher and more honest resolution, we can recognize our thoughts, our emotions, and feelings, or, as I've said again and again, any and all things that happen in our life. These things we can actually begin with higher self-consciousness or developed self-consciousness to see with the same importance as external events, but also as being the result of a kind of natural force which is as beyond we ourselves as individuals as the force that moves external happenings. That, just as I was saying, we don't claim to have created clouds, sky, earth, or anything like that. We can't, in a sense, really claim to be the devisers of our thoughts and feelings and emotions and sensations and all of these inner events. That if we just merely ask ourselves how these things could be generated or why we experience them at all, we run into the answer that we run into the problem that we can't really say that we chose to be thinkers and sensors and feelers, emotioners, and experiencers, observers, and we could go on and on. It's like the whole structure of what we are as human beings, our instincts as well, and I could include the lower levels, and like impulses, instincts, and all that. All of this, the whole thing that is the human being, none of us really invented it. We just find ourselves as human beings. And the forces that gave rise to human beings are thus beyond us and so much greater than us, and it's not really up to us it's not really up to us the package that we get, if you will, from nature, which decides what we are and what we have to work with, what kind of functions and nature we have to work with as human beings. It's kind of like we find ourselves in the circumstance that we do feel, we do have emotion and all of that stuff, and how we deal with it it's not pre-decided, and I like to think that self-consciousness can be the means to optimizing our function and our happiness or satisfaction with life, because the package that we inherit can sometimes become so difficult, and our organism can just behave in so many ways that we dislike and wish that it wouldn't. For example, people will have incredible panic or anxiety or depressive emotions, even things like indigestion and sleep apnea. My father has sleep apnea, or from the most physical aspects about us or structures that we are to the most spiritual and hidden and inner. We find all of these sorts of behaviors that fall outside of our control, and we experience indigestion sometimes whether or not we want to, or have to go to the bathroom when we're really far away from one and have to wait, or those sorts of things can happen. But also we can have very grueling and hideous emotions and thoughts that strike us as incredibly repulsive, and we question to ourselves, how could I think or feel such a thing? How could it be that horrid inside? And it becomes that way, and it's a real problem that people have to reckon with, and it may require therapy, somebody to guide you through the process of recognizing your human package, structure, system, or whatever you like that you've inherited, recognizing your humanity, that you are a human being, and it's not your fault for being a human being, or that human beings have the certain qualities and functions and all of that they do. None of us chose the human structure that we inherit, both the visible and obvious and the invisible and non-obvious structures that we have. And I think that considerate and thoughtful people can possibly reflect on these structures of human existence and thereby be able to move throughout the levels of one's being and to live in a way that engages all those levels, and thereby to live productively and give something to people in the world. Also to minimize one's problems and one's being problematic to others, that if people had some kind of familiarity with the levels of their inner existence and knew at least a little something about their inner life and how to satisfy its needs, I think that there are many invisible kind of needs that we have yet to really develop a serious understanding about, whereas we know that hunger is a kind of need that imposes itself on us, and that in order to satiate it, we have to eat something. I think that there are more spiritual and lesser known needs that each of us individually have, that it's really up to us to become more sensitive to, and to try and find ways to appease and satisfy, so that we're not destructive members of society and just barbarous and cruel creatures. I don't think we have to be this way. I think that spiritual liberation is something like the antidote to this, and it's not only a way of enriching your private existence and having a fuller internal life, but as a consequence of that, you're a more involved member in the world, and you do contribute, and people enjoy you more because you haven't neglected the upper levels, or you haven't gotten so caught up in the blind thoughts and behaviors and whatnot that can sometimes define our lives, and that I think it's really up to us, each of us, to be sensitive to the possibility that in any moment we might be confused about something, we don't really know all we need to know, and thus some forbearance and not acting immediately might be necessary. Just let the water settle in whatever the situation is, and allow time to tell you more about what it is that you need to know about, and be sensitive to the insights and the realizations, the revelations that you need to outgrow the confusion you're currently in. Is that I think that though we begin to understand things a little bit more as we move through life, each of us has our own confusions that we must be wary of, and if we are not wary of them, then they can lead us to blind behaviors and can ruin our lives and others, and there has to be this real and serious engagement with life on our part, I think, so that we advance self-consciousness as a species, which we can do on our own. That's the only way we can do it, is the inner and visible work of the alchemists. There's no real systematic way of explaining it. It's just this growing familiarity with one's inner life and how to move through the different levels and live a life that engages them all. I feel like I'm sort of repeating myself, but I think the message is very important, and I wish that I could communicate it in some simpler way. But to finish, I think that we're all sort of experiments in self-consciousness, and that I don't think it's for nothing. I think that it can lead to more. It can lead to an existence which is more, but that on the way, a lot of us get hung up in places that are less, and even in comparison, that in terms of spiritual development, you could think that we start as a worldly member in the world of the obvious, and the more spiritual we become, each of us as an individual moves through to the non-obvious levels of our inner existence. And the first one that we reach at is this fiery, intense emotionality that's actually quite dangerous and may also be likened to a wilderness, that there are possibilities of thought and emotion which can go hand in hand that are so dangerous and stand to overcome us if we don't, as self-consciousnesses, mature past them. And that takes recognizing one's lesser thoughts and emotions and putting them before oneself and recognizing them. Oh, I see you. I am not that thought or that emotion. It's a sort of event like the clouds or the firmament, the sky, and all of these structures of reality. It's thought and emotion both are structures of reality, like clouds and sky, and I need to treat them with that level of respect and not just diminish them as being mere fantasies because they're in me and I alone see them and they're mine, and reducing. This is the sort of tendency that a lot of us engage in, is reducing our inner subjective world, when really it is so unbelievably vast and rich and inexhaustible, and properly recognized, one would see that inner life, inner self-conscious existence offers us an infinity of possible avenues of search and investigation, admiration, appreciation. There's just an endless array of things that we can consider and appreciate in this life, if we're so inclined. Thank you, guys.